Hello, and welcome again to our consideration of the upcoming weekend of scriptures. This week, the 24th Sunday of the year, the first reading comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 32, verses 7 through 11, and then verses 13 and 14. Somehow they leave out verse 12. The second reading is the first letter of Paul to Timothy, chapter 1, verses 12 through 17, and then the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, verses 1 through 32. Now, this particular chapter, perhaps one of the most important chapters in the Lucan tradition, containing a story that is unique to the Lucan tradition and perhaps one of the most well-known of all of the parables of Jesus. In fact, verses 1 through 32 contain three parables. It begins by picturing Jesus as at dinner, and this is a common, of course, setting for many of the Lucan stories, at dinner with sinners and tax collectors. Now, this, of course, is always very irritating to the people who are in Luke's story watching what Jesus is doing. Remember how often that phrase will be attributed to the Pharisees and the scribes, watching what Jesus is doing. Now, sometimes it is watching to see if they can catch him in something that he shouldn't be doing. Other times, perhaps, watching Jesus is simply wondering and observing what he is not only teaching, but also what he is doing. So, and we have mentioned this before, and there are certain aspects of this particular gospel this time that we have heard before. Maybe this is a good place to start. There are three parables here. A parable dealing with sheep, a parable dealing with a coin, and then a parable dealing with two sons and a father who is how he relates to these two sons. And this, of course, this third parable is known as the parable of the prodigal son, prodigal father, prodigal sons. And I mention this because this particular, the third parable, was used for our consideration on the fourth Sunday of Lent. So I'm not sure this day how much we will really go to kind of analyze that again, because, and to be honest, it will be a certain repetition of insights that we looked at back in the season of Lent. But for whatever reasons, the liturgy this week chooses to look at those three parables. Now, at this dinner in which Jesus is sitting with sinners, now keep in mind, as we've mentioned before, and just to reiterate again, sinners does not necessarily mean someone who has been a murderer, an adulterer, someone who has certainly broke one of the moral codes or commandments of the tradition, but a sinner may simply be someone who is in need of forgiveness, someone who has in some ways violated a relationship with the covenant people, often maybe dealing with purity laws or other rules that would be considered by many Hebrews of the time as wrong, but not necessarily morally wrong. That's the point that being here is that often when we think of a sinner, it is someone who has broken a moral law. A sinner may be someone who has broken a ritual law. That also puts them in that category. The word sinner, of course, sin, we've mentioned before, means to miss the mark. Therefore, there are those who have missed the mark of keeping the rules that should be kept. He also sits with tax collectors. We pointed out, too, that tax collectors and toll collectors were two different categories. a tax collector was someone who collected taxes that went directly to the government, namely to maybe Herod Antipas, who was the Jewish leader of the place, or to the Romans, namely to the taxes that Rome levied against its colonies and against Palestine. Toll collectors were those who literally took care of toll booths, okay? Namely, certain taxes that were levied on people who were traveling through a place, much like you might go through a toll booth, although those are changing now too on the thruway, and would pay for the use of the road. That's technically what it would be. Or toll collectors also had collected on imports that were coming in from other parts, or tariffs. So there was a distinction, point being, between a tax collector and a toll collector. Tax collectors were direct taxes. Toll collections were indirect. What the difference there was that if you were a toll collector, you were given a certain amount of money that you were to collect in the course of a year, and then you had to figure out how you were going to get that to pay for what you had to already pay for and to make a profit. So Jesus here is pictured as being at dinner, at a banquet of some kind, with sinners and toll collectors. Now, what Jesus tells, and maybe I'll start here, begins with two parables. Typical of the Lucan tradition, as we have noticed before, that Luke often likes to pair parables, and these first two fall into this category. The first is that a man loses sheep. He has 100 sheep. He sets behind the 99 and goes in search of the one. When he has found the one that was lost, he places it on his shoulders and comes back to where the others were, and he says to everyone, "Rejoice with me because I have found that sheep which was lost." The second parable is about a woman who has 10 drachmas or coins, loses one, searches for it. When she finds it, she calls her neighbors together and says the same thing, "Rejoice with me because I have found the coin that I was lost." All right, so let's look at this a little bit. Shepherds. Now, we, of course, and we may have mentioned this before, have a kind of idealistic image of shepherds, mainly because the Johannine tradition pictures Jesus as the good shepherd. And in fact, in other parts of the scripture, God is sometimes pictured as a shepherd of Israel, a shepherd of the people. But the truth of the matter is that in real life, shepherds were often disdained. They were thought to be dishonest and thieving. They were thought sometimes at night to lead the sheep out of one person's kind of gathering and bring it into their own. And even sometimes they thought that shepherds at night engaged in other activities besides watching the sheep, namely maybe inviting themselves into people's homes and taking things that didn't belong to them. So in fact, shepherds were not necessarily considered to be honorable members of the society. Shepherds could be young people and old people. Shepherds could also be, interestingly, women, although that's not often mentioned. So it was a job that was, by our standards today, we would probably say low-level job, okay? And therefore, also shepherding at night was, now, let me put it this way. If you had 100 sheep, who could own 100 sheep? Only someone who was very rich. That would be a rich person could own those sheep, but he himself, the owner, would not be the shepherd. He would hire someone to take care of those sheep. Or 100 sheep could mean that a few sheep herders would bring their sheep together at night in order to keep them together. So that might explain why there would be such a large number. Also, you would have to find a place to keep 100 sheep, even for a night or an extended period of time. Another thought was, where did you keep these sheep? Well, you needed a place where they could get something to eat. And there was also a sneaking suspicion that sometimes when the shepherds brought the sheep out, they would go into land or areas that belonged to another person, ate their sheep, ate the grass there. And so you can see that the imagery, my point being, is that shepherds, when Jesus speaks of being a shepherd, now remember his audience are the scribes and the Pharisees. Who does he suggest would be the shepherd? One of you. See, so now there's a little bit of a disdain given to his audience here. It's another way that this might be interpreted. So if you lost one of those sheep, why would you go in search of it? Well, because if you did not own that sheep and you lost it, you might be responsible for that sheep. Some have pointed out, well, there's a kind of irony here. Would you leave 99 behind to go in search of one? Wouldn't the 99 be, doing whatever they're going to do? The assumption here might be is that although you leave the 99 behind, they are not unguarded, that there are some around, perhaps other shepherds or someone else who keeps watch there. This shepherd would not be that naive to think that 99 sheep are going to just stay there waiting for the lost sheep to be brought back. So there's a lot at work here. We pointed out a number of times that Luke likes stories that are very practical and yet at the same time have a certain amusing aspect to that, because those are the kind of stories that we remember, that capture our attention, and that maybe get us to listen to them again to see if there might not be some thing about it. Now, what might be the humorous little aspect here? When the shepherd finds the lost sheep, he puts it on his shoulders. Now we've had these beautiful images of Jesus carrying the sheep on the shoulder. That's fine. Keep in mind that it's no small thing to carry a sheep on your shoulder. Sheep were about 70 pounds or better. So to carry that, particularly if he found the sheep wandering around rocky or terrain, and to carry it back was not an easy task. So you can kind of almost see a kind of smile on the face of the hearer. Here is a shepherd who does all of this for the sake of one sheep. So the shepherd must be either crazy to do this for the sheep or see the importance because he did not own the sheep but was a shepherd working for someone else and realized that if he did not return that sheep, he would be the one held responsible. So all of that, in a certain way, might lie behind this parable of the shepherd. When he comes back, notice what he says, "Rejoice with me because I have found the sheep that was lost." So he's talking to a community. Who is the community that he's talking to? Could be, and most likely would be, fellow shepherds, those also who, like him, were responsible for the flock. And so there's a community aspect to it, a rejoicing, a gladness that that which was lost has been found. There's the theme. Something is lost, something is found, and there's a rejoicing. Now keep this in mind that the three parables have that same theme, a lost, a finding, and a rejoicing. The second is a woman has 10 coins. We believe it would be a drachma. A drachma would be equivalent, we've mentioned this before, to about a day's wage. Now, she loses one of them. Well, what is so important about losing a lost coin? Well, different interpretations, of course, are offered here. Some would say, well, the lost coin was nothing more than maybe losing 10 dimes. Would you go and search for one coin like this until you found it? Well, if that is, I would suggest a translation that maybe misses the point of this particular parable. A drachma, as I mentioned, would be worth more, and if indeed that would be important to be found, if it were lost, that could mean a whole meal or a day's kind of sustenance for the family would be lost. Well, where would she find it? Now we think households. Don't think of your kitchen nicely done and remodeled, and some of you probably have remodeled your kitchen 8 times already since you moved there or are thinking of doing it. But in those days, the kitchen was just a simple kind of place where perhaps appropriate cooking went. You never really ate there. There were other places that you ate. The floor was dirty and ground, and so if you lost something there, and it was often dark, that would be my point here, required a certain amount of searching. What, however, and this is one interpretation, there are, as I say, these parables are open to a number of interpretations over the years, but what if the lost coin were part of a set of decorative coins on a bridal headdress or a necklace? So therefore, if one of those came loose and were lost, it was part of a woman's dowry. Or what if the whole necklace, because of the loss of that one coin, was now rendered worthless because it didn't have the full complement of coins? So some have said, if that were the case, if this were truly something important to the woman and it got lost, her efforts to search for it until it was found did and does make sense. So, and again, as a little bit of a slur to the Pharisees, remember where Jesus says to the Pharisees, what if you were the shepherd, therefore unclean, a member of a despised and forsaken, forbidden profession? Or even worse, what if you were a woman? Which woman of you? See? So there are a variety of ways in which these two particular parables can be and have been interpreted. And thus what you could see why, if this were truly a valuable coin that the woman had lost, when she finds it, she says to whom? To the community. Rejoice with me because I have found that which was lost. Now there's the similarity of these two parables between lost and found, and also what they say. In both cases, there is a rejoicing hoped for and expressed with the community. So, and as I mentioned, characteristic of Luke, likes a him and her story. So again, you can see this. Shepherds were men, coin lost were women. So that might be another important characteristic to notice of Luke here, okay? Namely what we would call paired episodes, woman and man. Now, that probably is what you will hear on Sunday or weekend. There's a shortened version, but if you hear the full story, and maybe it's important to see these three parables as Luke presents them as working together, characterized, as I mentioned, by the fact that they are addressed to the scribes and Pharisees who accused Jesus of eating with sinners and tax collectors. This then brings the story, and I very, very briefly, maybe we spend a little time looking at the other readings today, with the third parable, which we have analyzed before, namely a father has two sons. The younger son comes to him, in effect says to his father, I wish you were dead so that I can receive the inheritance that will be due to me. Well, the father gives the young son what he wants. The young son goes off, lives it up, but over a period of time, in the parable you will remember, and you can kind of look at this again, falls on hard times, a drought hits the land, food is at a minimum, then at a point it runs out of money, finds himself having to work for another. Now it could be a fellow Hebrew, or it could have even been a Gentile, depending on how one wants to analyze this. And he is given a job of taking care of swine or pigs. Again, if you were Jewish, this would be a terrible kind of thing. And he's pictured as saying, he would eat what he was feeding to the pigs if only someone had offered it to him. Then he comes to his senses, and he says, back in my father's household, why, the servants have something to eat and drink and a place to live. I know what I will do. I will go back and say to my father, I have sinned against you and against heaven. I am no longer worthy to be called your son, but would you please take me back? And we've looked at how that could be interpreted. He comes back. When his father sees him, it's interesting that the father is pictured as waiting for the son to return, sees him coming at a distance, runs to meet him, immediately welcomes him back, says, you need better clothes than you have, and then says, let us kill the fatted calf. Now, keep in mind that lost, found, and the celebrate. If you just look at the parable, this is half that parable. At this point, once again, there's a communal aspect here. And it's important to notice that what had happened when the son had said, give me what is going to be my inheritance when you die, the community saw what had happened. The community saw that the son had brought shame to his father, dishonor to his father. So when we hear these parables, and you notice, as I mentioned, that the community is rejoicing with the shepherd with the lost sheep, the woman with the lost coin. So now the community is involved, and that's why slaughtering the fatted calf is significant. We may have mentioned this earlier when we looked at it the first time, but notice that if you kill the calf, that's enough food to feed in terms of meat, unless you're a vegetarian, but at that time, over 100 people. So the idea was that the community would be involved in reconciling the son back to the family, and would, in effect, by eating that meat, join with the father in welcoming his son home. You remember that second part of this parable is the elder son who, coming in, hears what is going on, refuses to come to the celebration. The father goes out to meet the son. The son complains that he's been faithful and loyal, but never once did he or his friends ever have the opportunity to even have a sheep or a goat. Now, so keep in mind, those of you who like lamb chops were not considered to be the same as steaks, and even today, I guess that argument might go on. He also slurs his father. He says, you welcome home this son who has kind of hung out with, and here's where the slur goes, with prostitutes and those who are of less importance. Now notice, breaking the law, as going back to the very beginning, the Pharisees were very concerned about all kinds of things, but this would have been, if it were true, breaking the law. But again, that's kind of a slur that the older brother brings against the younger brother. And as good parables go, that one ends by the father saying, well, we must rejoice and be glad because, here's the key, this son of ours, mine, which was, and this brother of yours, who was lost, has been found, and we need to rejoice. Parable ends without knowing what the elder brother does. So you can, if you would, go back and check the material for the fourth Sunday of Lent and see a fuller kind of explanation of this third parable. All right, quickly, the first reading comes from the book of Exodus. This has to do again with, the Exodus story is that the Israelites have built a golden calf. Now, just a little background here. Golden calf, we often think of the kind of calf perhaps that was seen with Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. Aaron has built this calf. But the golden calves were often stands. You know, like you have a stand that you're going to put a statue on. And that's what they were building. But they were building stands to put, well, some image of God. And God has no image, of course, in the Hebrew tradition. And he accuses, and there's this dialogue in which God says, I'm going to get rid of the Israelites, and Moses pleads, oh, keep them, and Moses argues, after all, the Israelites are your people. It would be a shame if you destroy them now, and remember the promise that you made to your ancestors while they were in Egypt. Now, one of the kind of things just here to mention, this is perhaps what we would call anthropomorphism. Namely, keep in mind, describing God with human emotions. God is angry with the Israelites. Well, humans get angry. Careful, God does not get angry, although people speak like that. Is God angry with me? Is that why things don't go the way that I ask? So it's a kind of interesting. We tend to do this with regard to God. Can God really be swayed by such silly arguments that Moses presents to the Israelites? Why should God care about honor and reputation? After all, who cares about that? Humans. Does God care about that? And why did God make such a bad choice to begin with? If he were going to destroy the Israelites, well, why would he knows what he was going to do. Why would he kind of now get rid of them because they turned out to be unfaithful? So it's important to see that the theology, if you want, the thinking about God that we have, that Israel had, and the stories reflect this, and that certainly we have, is that we have to be very careful when we picture God with human terms. But we do that, perhaps it's because theology can only talk by way of analogy, namely, you take what you know and apply it to what is the unknown. So does God, in other words, and it's an interesting argument here, does Moses convince God? Does God give in and not punish the people as he had thought to do? So you can see all the kind of human element that goes to work here in this interesting little story about God's anger against the Israelites. God accuses the people of being stiff-necked. By the way, this would be something that applies to an ox or a mule who don't respond. Now, if you can't get you obviously the donkey that doesn't move, or the mule, we make jokes about that. What they would do is tie a rope around its neck and pulls it because it has a stiff neck to get it to turn its neck. So this is illustrative of stubbornness. So, and what's concluded here is God also says to Moses, I'm going to get rid of these people, but I will make you the father of a great nation, offering Moses a choice. Moses says, no, listen, God, they're your people, you need to take care of them, and he convinces them to do that. So all of that kind of shows what? The pleading for forgiveness and understanding that Moses makes with God, and God gives in. And that in some way matches perhaps the forgiveness going to the third parable that Jesus teaches, that the Father extends to both sons. and that's very important. So this is really a very enriched kind of set of readings. We will, in coming weeks, look at the second reading, letters attributed to Paul, a little bit in more detail. But for now, let's not hope that God puts any ropes around our necks if we become stiff-necked to one another. If not, and I know it's not true, thank you for being with us, and we'll see you again sometime soon, I hope.